Her billionaire husband removed her from the house deed. She found her name again downtown. The mansion deed lay cold in Sarah Albright's hand, 11 pages of polished legal language designed to make a wife disappear from her own life. Across the mahogany table, her bright red dress burned against the private signing room like a warning no one had been wise enough to read. Richard Greystone stood opposite her in an elegant black suit, his white cuff visible beneath one sleeve, his expression calm, with the expensive arrogance of a man who believed money could edit reality. Beside him, Jane Vailmont wore a white silk dress that made her look delicate from a distance and victorious up close. Richard gave a thin, self-satisfied smile, already certain Sarah would sign in silence, because the gala guests were arriving downstairs, because reputation mattered in rooms like this, because he thought humiliation could be disguised as composure if the victim was trained well enough. Sarah looked at the signature line, then at the red pen waiting beside the document. She picked it up. She signed her name slowly, every letter clean, deliberate, alive. Then she drove the tip of the red pen through the waiver, pinning it hard into the wooden table beneath it. The paper buckled. The pen stood upright like a small red stake through a fraudulent empire. Sarah released it, turned away from Richard and Jane, and walked toward the door, with her eyes cold, steady, and already pointed toward downtown. No one moved for 3 seconds, not because they were frightened of her body, but because they had finally seen her mind. Richard's smile did not vanish theatrically. He only tightened his jaw, as if the room had become 1 inch smaller around his throat. Jane looked at the red pen fixed in the document, and then back at Sarah, suddenly aware that a woman who did not ask questions might already have answers. "You just signed away the house," Richard said, keeping his voice low, because power, to him, had always meant never sounding strained. Sarah stopped at the doorway, one hand resting on the brass handle. She did not look back immediately. Behind the walls, caterers were arranging white orchids, crystal glasses, and a charity banner that carried Jane's name, as if generosity could be printed over theft. Downstairs, the first guests would soon step into a mansion they believed was being offered to the city's most admired philanthropic circle. Upstairs, the truth sat in folders Richard had forgotten Sarah knew how to read. "No," Sarah said at last, turning only enough for him to see the edge of her face. "I signed proof." Richard's eyes narrowed. He had built his fortune on timing, pressure, and people too embarrassed to fight in public. He had chosen this hour because the gala made Sarah look trapped. If she refused, he could call her unstable. If she argued, he could call her bitter. If she cried, Jane could float downstairs in white silk and inherit the room's sympathy before dessert was served. But Sarah gave him none of those gifts. She walked out of the signing room, with her shoulders level and her chin lifted, passing the quiet assistant without a word. In the hallway mirror, she saw herself for one brief second. A black woman in red, 35 years old, elegant, wounded, and not yet alone enough to let the wound show. Her hand tightened around the handle of her leather folder. Inside were copies Richard did not know existed, records he thought had been buried under trust language, charity language, marital language, all the soft words rich men used when they wanted theft to sound like planning. At the top of the staircase, Sarah paused only long enough to look down at the gala floor being prepared like a stage for Jane's coronation. Then she descended, not as Richard Greystone's wife, not as the woman removed from the deed, but as the only person in that house who understood where the real signature had just been placed. At the front entrance, a driver opened the door. Sarah stepped into the evening air, red dress bright beneath the mansion lights, and said one destination with surgical calm. Downtown. The car pulled away from the mansion gates, with Sarah Albright seated in the back, her leather folder pressed flat against her knees like a verdict waiting for the right courtroom. Through the rear window, the house glowed behind her, all limestone walls, tall windows, and curated elegance, the kind of wealth designed to make people lower their voices before they had even been asked to. Tonight, Richard Greystone wanted that glow to belong to Jane Vailmont. He wanted the city's donors, bankers, trustees, and society editors to walk through those doors and accept a lie dressed as charity. Sarah watched the lights shrink in the glass until the mansion no longer looked like a home. It looked like evidence. For the first mile, she said nothing. The driver kept both hands on the wheel, careful not to ask the wrong question. Sarah's reflection hovered in the dark window, red dress, steady mouth, eyes too focused to be mistaken for shock. Then, as the private road gave way to the main avenue, the silence finally found the crack Richard had left in her. Her fingers loosened on the folder. Her chest tightened once, sharply, not from fear, but from the delayed recognition that the man who used to say our house had spent months turning that word into a trap. She remembered choosing the East Library shelves, approving the stone for the front steps, signing renovation invoices, hosting dinners where Richard praised her taste in front of people whose approval he secretly needed. Every room in that mansion held some small proof that she had been there, and still, he had tried to reduce her to a missing line on a deed. Sarah lowered her eyes. For one private moment, with no audience and no need to perform dignity, pain moved through her face. It did not break her. It clarified her. She opened the folder and looked at the first document, the original deed, with her name printed beside Richard's in black ink. Behind it were scanned amendments, trust transfers, internal memoranda, donation schedules, and a chain of emails between Richard's finance office and the charity administrators Jane pretended to lead. Richard had not simply removed Sarah from a house. He had moved the house through a charitable shell, wrapped it in philanthropic language, used inflated valuations, disguised personal expenses as institutional costs, and routed private benefit through accounts that were never meant to survive serious scrutiny. He had believed complexity was the same thing as safety. Sarah knew better. She had built her early career inside financial risk reviews, before Richard's circle learned to introduce her as a beautiful wife instead of a dangerous mind. The city widened around them. Gated estates became office parks, then glass towers, then the hard vertical shine of downtown. Streetlights drew lines across her face as the car crossed 6 lanes and passed the first federal buildings. The driver glanced at her in the mirror. "Which entrance, ma'am?" Sarah closed the folder, the moment of hurt sealed back into discipline. "The visitor entrance on the east side." Her voice was calm enough to make the instructions sound ordinary, which made it more final. When the car stopped, she stepped onto the curb in her red dress, a little over 5 feet 7 inches of controlled fury beneath downtown lights. She did not look like a woman running from a gala. She looked like a witness arriving on time. Inside the leather folder, Richard's empire had already begun to testify against him. Sarah crossed the stone plaza toward the federal building, heels measured, shoulders squared, the mansion behind her reduced to a problem of numbers, signatures, and fraud. At the security desk, the guard asked the purpose of her visit. Sarah placed her identification on the counter and held the folder close. "I'm here to report a tax crime." The federal building did not care about Richard Greystone's last name, his black suit, or the way society rooms rearranged themselves around his money. Its lobby was bright, plain, and unforgiving, built for identification cards, security cameras, numbered offices, and people who understood that paper could carry more force than reputation. Sarah Albright passed through the metal detector with her leather folder under one arm and her red dress moving like a controlled flame beneath the fluorescent lights. A security officer directed her to an upper floor where the carpet softened each step but did nothing to soften the purpose of the place. She waited in a small interview room with beige walls, a sealed water bottle on the table, and a clock that made no drama of passing time. For the first time, that evening, no one was watching her as a wife, a guest, an accessory, or a woman expected to preserve a billionaire's dignity. She was simply the person who had brought evidence. When the senior tax investigator entered, with a quiet assistant carrying a tablet, Sarah stood, shook his hand, and sat only after he did. "Tell me what you believe happened," he said. Sarah opened the folder and placed the original deed on the table first. "My husband removed my name from our primary residence without proper disclosure, then moved the property through a charity structure controlled by his mistress." She laid down the amended deed next, then the charity incorporation documents bearing Jane Vailmont's signature. The public story is philanthropy. The private function is concealment. The investigator did not react quickly. That was his discipline. Sarah respected it. She continued, sliding each exhibit forward in order: valuation reports, donor schedules, internal wire summaries, renovation invoices labeled as charitable programming expenses, and email chains that showed Richard's finance team discussing how to keep the mansion socially useful while preserving private access. The language was careful, but not careful enough. One email referred to the property as the Greystone Residence, after it had supposedly been committed to the charitable entity. Another listed Jane's gala wardrobe, floral design, imported champagne, private security, and guest accommodations as donor engagement costs. Sarah tapped that page once. Those are personal expenses disguised as institutional spending. The senior tax investigator leaned closer. How did you obtain these records? As a spouse, with prior administrative access, before that access was revoked tonight. Her voice remained clean. I did not alter, destroy, or remove originals. These are copies and digital exports. Metadata is preserved. The quiet assistant looked up then, and Sarah saw the shift she had been waiting for. Not sympathy, credibility. She opened a second section of the folder and revealed the transaction map she had made herself, color-coded in red, black, and gray. Richard believed the structure was too complicated for me to follow. It was not. The investigator studied the map, then the emails, then the deed trail again. Minute by minute, the room changed. It began as a complaint intake. It became a financial anatomy lesson. Sarah explained how the mansion had been valued above market, transferred under charitable language, used to generate deductions, and then quietly retained for private entertainment. She showed how donor pledges were routed through affiliated accounts, how consulting fees returned to entities Richard controlled, and how Jane's title gave the arrangement a softer public face. You understand the seriousness of what you're alleging, the investigator said. Yes. Sarah folded her hands. Tax evasion, false charitable representation, possible money laundering, and fraud tied to marital asset concealment. He paused. Why come tonight? Sarah looked at the red mark on her finger, where the pen had pressed too hard during the signing. Because tonight he put the lie in writing and invited half the city to applaud it. The investigator closed one folder and opened a formal intake file. We'll need sworn statements, digital verification, and permission to contact your counsel. You'll have them. Sarah did not smile. Victory was too small a word for what this was. Victory sounded emotional. This was structural. This was a door closing behind a man who had mistaken access for ownership. When she finally left the interview room, the leather folder was thinner, but she felt taller. Downstairs, downtown traffic moved beneath the federal windows, indifferent and bright. Behind her, the machinery of law had begun to turn. Ahead of her, Richard Greystone was still inside the mansion, preparing to raise a glass beneath Jane Vailmont's charity banner, unaware that the sharpest blade in the room was no longer made of silver, crystal, or social approval. It was a case number. And here is what most people misunderstand about betrayal. It does not always begin with another woman, a hidden account, a locked door, or a signature placed in the wrong room. The deeper betrayal begins when someone decides you are not intelligent enough to notice the architecture of your own erasure. Richard Greystone did not only want Sarah Albright out of the mansion. He wanted her out of the story. He wanted the deed to say she had never mattered, the charity banner to say Jane Vailmont had earned legitimacy, and the gala to say wealth could rewrite truth if the lighting was expensive enough. Tell me, what kind of arrogance makes a man look at a brilliant woman and see only silence? That is not confidence. That is a dangerous miscalculation wearing a black suit. And Sarah understood something he did not. Humiliation becomes power the moment it is documented correctly. 14 floors above downtown, Sarah stood inside a private advisory office, where the walls were glass, the carpets were quiet, and the city spread beneath her like a ledger waiting to be balanced. The room did not smell like orchids, champagne, or stage charity. It smelled faintly of polished wood, printer ink, and expensive restraint. Around a long conference table sat members of an elite financial council. Not the party guests Richard had trained to flatter him, but people who measured power in risk exposure, forensic accuracy, and the ability to see disaster before it reached the headline. Sarah's red dress did not look wounded here. It looked intentional. A senior board representative placed a thin file in front of her. No one called her Mrs. Greystone. No one asked whether Richard would be joining. No one mentioned Jane except as a legal liability inside an emerging federal matter. Your analysis was unusually precise, the representative said. You identified the charitable shell, the deed transfer, the private benefit issue, and the circular payments before any outside audit flagged them. Sarah rested one hand on the table, calm enough to let the compliment pass through the room without feeding on it. The structure was not sophisticated, she said. It was protected by ego. A few faces shifted, not with laughter, but with recognition. That sentence had weight because it was true. The council had spent years watching fortunes collapse from the same disease. Powerful men confusing secrecy with intelligence. Sarah opened the presentation file they had asked her to review, a separate portfolio belonging to one of the city's private foundations. She moved through it with clean precision, noting conflicts of interest, inflated service contracts, donor exposure, and governance weaknesses in language sharp enough to cut, but controlled enough to trust. Every recommendation landed like a door being locked before a storm could enter. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became 40. By the end, the room had stopped evaluating her and started relying on her. The representative slid a formal letter across the table. The council would like to retain you as an independent financial consultant, effective immediately if you accept. Sarah looked at the letter. Her name appeared at the top in black ink. Sarah Albright. Not as someone's wife. Not as a removed party. Not as a social accessory in a mansion she had helped build. Her name stood alone, clean and undeniable, inside the one place Richard had never expected her to be powerful, the machinery that understood money better than he did. She picked up a pen, not red this time, and signed with steady pressure. How would you like to be introduced at the reception? The representative asked. Sarah closed the folder and looked toward the downtown skyline, where glass towers caught the last hard light of evening. By my name, she said. Only my name. At the mansion, Richard Greystone stood beneath a suspended crystal installation and watched the city's most expensive people mistake fraud for elegance. The grand hall had been transformed into a theater of false virtue. White orchids along the staircase, silver trays moving between tuxedos, champagne poured into tall glasses, and a charity banner hanging above the marble fireplace, with Jane Valmont's name printed in graceful gold lettering. Everything was arranged to suggest purity. Everything was built to conceal rot. Richard wore his black suit, as if it were armor, the fabric tailored, within an inch of perfection, his posture relaxed enough to tell the room he still owned every conversation before it began. Jane moved beside him in her white silk dress, accepting compliments with lowered lashes and a soft hand over her chest, performing humility with the confidence of a woman who had already measured the curtains. Guests praised her compassion. Trustees admired the foundation's vision. Donors leaned close and asked how soon the mansion would begin hosting cultural programs for underserved communities. Jane answered with rehearsed tenderness, speaking of access, legacy, and social responsibility, while standing on floors polished by money that had been routed through the very structure she pretended to sanctify. Richard listened, pleased. He did not look toward the front entrance, where Sarah Albright had left. In his mind, her role in the evening was finished. She had signed. She had walked out. She would be processed later through attorneys, statements, and whatever quiet settlement could be made to sound generous. Sarah always struggled with the public side of our obligations, Jane said to a small cluster of guests, her voice gentle enough to wound, without appearing cruel. Richard did not correct her. That was the point. His silence placed a velvet rope between Sarah and the society that had once smiled at her across dinner tables. A woman in pearls lowered her voice. A private banker lifted his glass and pretended not to hear too much. The room understood social execution when it saw it. It only objected when the execution was messy, Richard stepped onto the low platform near the fireplace, raising one hand for attention. Conversations thinned. The string quartet eased into silence because someone had given them the signal. He looked over the guests, the trustees, the public relations team, the photographers, the senior lawyer standing discreetly near the wall, and Jane glowing in white at the center of his staged redemption. Tonight, Richard began, we are not merely celebrating a property transfer or a foundation launch. We are honoring the belief that private success carries public responsibility. The words landed smoothly, expensive and empty. Jane's eyes shone, as if she had been personally chosen by history. Richard continued, describing the mansion as a future space for leadership forums, scholarship dinners, and civic advance. He spoke of generosity, while knowing the East Wing would remain reserved for private gatherings. The wine cellar would stay under his control, and the foundation's accounts would absorb expenses no honest charity would touch. He believed language could make ownership disappear. He believed applause could disinfect motive. Across the room, guests nodded because they had been trained to reward confidence before evidence. Richard lifted his glass higher. And I want to recognize Jane Vailmont, whose vision and grace have made this new chapter possible. Applause rose around her. Jane lowered her head, with practiced modesty, then placed her fingers lightly on Richard's sleeve, claiming him, the room, and the house in one small gesture. For one flawless second, the entire lie held together. The mansion lights warmed the marble. The glasses caught the gold. Richard's voice remained steady. Jane's white dress gleamed beneath the charity banner. Downstairs, no one knew that 14 floors above downtown, Sarah's name had just been spoken without his. No one knew that inside a federal office, the deed, the transfers, the emails, and the false expenses had already become a case file. Richard smiled for the cameras, not broadly, not foolishly, but with the controlled satisfaction of a man convinced the final page had been written by him. Then the front doors opened behind the guests, and the room turned toward a kind of authority that did not need an invitation. The federal agents entered the mansion with the kind of restraint that made the room feel smaller, without anyone raising a voice. They did not rush. They did not threaten. They moved through the open doors in dark professional suits, identification visible, faces composed, the law arriving not as spectacle but as procedure. Richard Greystone kept his glass lifted for one extra second, as if refusing to lower it might preserve the illusion that he was still hosting the evening. Jane Vailmont's fingers tightened on his sleeve, her white silk dress suddenly too bright beneath the charity banner that had just become evidence in front of 200 witnesses. The lead agent stepped forward, followed by a second agent carrying a sealed packet, and another who moved toward the senior lawyer near the wall. Richard Greystone, the lead agent said, clear enough for the first rows to hear. We have federal orders related to this property, the Greystone charitable entity, and associated financial accounts. The string quartet had already stopped because the musicians understood authority faster than the donors did. A server lowered a tray of champagne onto a side table with both hands. Cameras that had been aimed at Jane turned toward the entrance. Richard set his glass down carefully, not because he was calm, but because his hand had begun to betray him. This is a private event, he said. Then your counsel should review this immediately, the lead agent replied, handing the packet to the senior lawyer. That sentence did more damage than an accusation. It told the room this was not a misunderstanding, not a social interruption, not a jealous wife's disturbance dragged into public. It was paper. It was court language. It was the one dialect Richard could not charm by lowering his voice. The senior lawyer opened the packet, read the first page, then stopped moving for a moment too long. Richard saw it. So did Jane. So did the banker, who had praised the foundation 20 minutes earlier. The lead agent continued. This property is subject to federal restriction pending investigation. Certain accounts connected to the charitable entity are frozen. Records, devices, and financial materials identified in the order are to be preserved and surrendered as directed. Jane stepped forward, trying to recover the role she had been rehearsing all night. There must be some mistake. The foundation is philanthropic. We are launching community programs. Her voice carried the delicate polish she used with donors, but the lead agent did not answer the performance. Jane Vailmont, documents bearing your signature are included in the review. The color in her composure changed. She looked toward Richard, expecting him to translate disaster back into control. Richard did not move toward her. He was staring at the senior lawyer, waiting for a signal that never came. Around them, the room began its quiet rearrangement. The people closest to Richard took half a step back. A trustee put his glass on the nearest table and turned his shoulders away. A woman in diamonds opened her phone, then thought better of it and lowered it against her clutch. The charity banner above the fireplace, with its gold lettering and expensive promise, now looked less like a symbol and more like an exhibit. "You can't freeze a residence during a gala," Richard said, but the sentence lacked the force he intended. "The order is active," the lead agent said. "Guests will be directed to exit through the South Hall after identification is confirmed. No one is to remove documents, drives, phones assigned to foundation operations, or financial materials from this property." A low current moved through the crowd, not panic, but calculation. Everyone in that mansion knew how quickly proximity became liability. The same men who had sought Richard's handshake now studied the floor. The same women who had complimented Jane's white dress now looked at it, as if it had been worn to the wrong trial. Richard turned toward the photographer near the staircase. No pictures, but the command died in the space between them. He no longer controlled the room's memory. He no longer controlled the story. At the edge of the hall, the senior lawyer finally approached him and spoke in a voice too low for the guests, but not low enough to hide the meaning. "Do not answer questions here." Richard's jaw tightened. Jane whispered his name, but he did not look at her. For the first time, that night, the mansion belonged to neither of them. It belonged to the investigation. The lead agent stood beneath the crystal installation and delivered the sentence that cut through every orchid, every glass, every false word about legacy. "This property is now under federal restriction." Upstairs, the red pen still pinned Sarah Albright's signature to the wounded document. Downtown, her name had already been restored where it mattered. By the next morning, Richard Greystone's fall did not look like a dramatic collapse. It looked colder than that. It looked like unanswered calls, frozen accounts, suspended board privileges, and doors that had opened for 20 years suddenly requiring appointments. The mansion remained under federal restriction, its gates watched by security, and its grand rooms no longer available for curated photographs, donor dinners, or Jane Vailmont's rehearsed speeches about compassion. A white tent from the gala still stood on the rear lawn, half cleared, its rented furniture stacked in careful rows like evidence of a celebration that had died before dessert. Richard stood in the upstairs study wearing the same black suit from the night before, the jacket unbuttoned now, the collar still perfect, but the man inside it beginning to come apart in quieter ways. His phone lay on the desk, with 12 missed calls from attorneys, 6 from financial officers, and none from the people who had toasted him under crystal light. That absence cut deeper than accusation. Society did not punish Richard because it had suddenly discovered morality. It punished him because he had exposed risk in public. He had made private corruption visible, and in his world visibility was the unforgivable sin. A major bank froze an expansion credit line before noon. A museum board postponed his honorary chairmanship by mid-afternoon. 2 investment partners requested immediate forensic review of all shared ventures. A private club sent a message written in the softest language possible, explaining that his presence would be unhelpful during the current review period. Richard read that line twice, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood it too well. He had been removed, without being named, the same way he had tried to remove Sarah Albright from the deed. Jane did not float through the mansion in white silk anymore. She sat in a side room, with her hands folded around a glass of untouched water, wearing a pale cashmere wrap over the same dress, speaking to the senior lawyer in careful fragments. She insisted she had trusted Richard. She insisted she had signed what she was told to sign. She insisted the charity was real because events had been planned, invitations had been sent, and community language had been printed on thick paper. The senior lawyer gave her no comfort. A signature did not become innocent because the ink looked elegant. Downstairs, the staff moved quietly under federal instruction, preserving documents, labeling boxes, and leaving digital equipment exactly where it had been found. Richard watched them from the landing and felt the first true shape of powerlessness. No one shouted at him. No one touched him. No one needed to. The restriction order had done what Sarah never had to do with her voice. It had turned his house into a locked file. Across the city, Sarah did not answer reporters. She did not issue a statement. She did not post a sentence sharpened for public applause. In downtown, she sat behind a glass conference wall, reviewing risk disclosures for the elite council that had retained her, her red dress replaced by a tailored red blazer that carried the same authority without needing to explain itself. When a quiet assistant placed a tablet in front of her showing the first headlines, Sarah read only the confirmed facts: federal review, charitable entity, mansion restriction, financial accounts frozen. She handed the tablet back. "No comment," she said. "We have work." That restraint traveled farther than any revenge speech could have. By evening, Richard's name had become something people lowered before saying. Jane's name had become something people avoided. And Sarah Albright's name, once erased from a deed, began appearing in rooms where Richard was no longer welcome. At the mansion gate, Richard stood behind the iron bars and looked toward the long driveway he used to believe announced his importance. His right hand trembled once against the cold metal. Not dramatically, not for anyone to see. Just enough for him to understand that ownership had left him before the house ever did. Richard Greystone came to downtown 3 days after the gala, not in defeat that anyone could photograph, but in the stripped-down condition of a man who had run out of rooms where his name still opened doors. His black suit was still expensive, still tailored, still meant to signal control, yet the fabric could no longer perform the man it had been purchased to protect. He waited in the reception area outside the elite council's advisory office, surrounded by glass walls, muted art, and quiet people who did not look impressed by billionaires in crisis. When the quiet assistant told Sarah Albright he had arrived, she did not stop reviewing the file in front of her. She finished the paragraph, marked one line, closed the folder, and said, "Give him 10 minutes. Not because he deserved them. Because she wanted the ending to be exact. When Richard entered, he did not kneel, did not cry, did not throw himself into apology. That would have been too easy, too theatrical, too useful for a man who had always known how to turn emotion into negotiation. He stood near the door, with one hand at his side, and the other brushing the cuff of his sleeve, a small repeated motion that gave away what his face tried to hide. His voice arrived late. "Sarah." She looked up from behind the conference table. She wore red again, not the gala dress, but a clean, sharp red suit that made the room feel more organized around her. Behind her, downtown rose in hard vertical lines, glass and steel replacing the mansion's marble and staged warmth. "Richard," she said. No softness, no performance. Just recognition of a name that no longer had power over her. He stepped farther into the room, then stopped as if the distance between them had legal weight. "This has gone too far." Sarah let the sentence rest on the table until its weakness became visible. "It went too far when you moved a marital residence through a charitable shell and placed your mistress in front of it as decoration." His jaw worked, but no answer came quickly enough. The old Richard would have corrected her tone. The old Richard would have leaned into charm, threat, or strategy. This Richard swallowed once, and the sound of his throat moving was the only confession he seemed able to make. "I was trying to protect assets." "No," Sarah said. "You were trying to protect access while removing accountability." His fingers trembled against his sleeve. He folded them into his palm. "You know what federal charges could do to me." "Yes. You could soften this." Sarah's eyes stayed on him, steady and almost merciful in their refusal to lie. "I could have softened many things. The night you asked me to sign away my place in my own home. The moment Jane stood beside you wearing innocence like a costume. The years you let rooms call me elegant, while you quietly taught them not to call me capable." Richard took a breath, but it did not become speech. The silence around him thickened. For once, his wealth could not hire a better sentence. Sarah stood, gathering one folder from the table. You did not lose everything because I exposed you. You lost it because your entire structure required everyone else to stay less informed than you. That is not power, Richard. That is a design flaw. His eyes shifted toward the city behind her, perhaps searching for the skyline that used to belong to him in some imaginary way. We had a life, he said, quieter now. Sarah moved around the table, stopping several feet from him. We had a house. We had events. We had photographs. A life requires honesty. You replaced that with paperwork. The words did not rise. They landed. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, and the self-assurance he had worn for years finally broke, without spectacle. Not a collapse. Not a scene. Just a man losing the ability to command the air around him. Sarah looked at him one last time. You did not erase my name, she said. You only showed me where it belonged. Then she walked past him toward the door. He turned slightly, as if to follow, but stopped before taking a step. There were no guards blocking him, no audience judging him, no dramatic force holding him in place. Only the truth. Sarah left first, her red suit moving through the glass corridor with absolute calm, while Richard Greystone remained in the conference room, standing beside a chair he had never been invited to own. There is a price to betrayal, and it is never paid by only one person. It returns to the betrayer as a bill with interest. A man like Richard Greystone believes betrayal is a private act, something hidden in offices, contracts, accounts, and carefully timed humiliations. But betrayal has a structure. It leaves records. It leaves witnesses. It leaves patterns in the way one person tries to make another person smaller on paper before daring to do it in public. And here is the lesson most powerful people learn too late. When you steal someone's place, you teach them exactly where to build next. Sarah Albright did not win because she shouted louder. She won because she understood the system Richard tried to weaponize against her. Tell me, what would you do if the person who promised you a home tried to erase your name from it? Sarah answered with evidence, discipline, and a future too large for his shadow. Months later, downtown knew her name before she entered a room. Not as Richard Greystone's wife. Not as the woman removed from a mansion deed. Not as the silent figure in red who walked out before a gala. She was Sarah Albright, independent financial consultant, risk strategist, and the woman elite boards called when their foundations, trusts, and private holdings needed truth before scandal found them first. Her office stood high above the city, with floor-to-ceiling glass, a long black table, and a single red leather chair she had chosen herself. There were no wedding portraits on the shelves, no mansion photographs, no sentimental trophies from a life that had asked her to be decorative while borrowing her intelligence in private. Instead, there were case files, advisory letters, signed retainers, and a framed copy of her first council appointment. Her name stood at the top, clean and undeniable. Sarah wore red often now, not because pain had branded her, but because she had reclaimed the color as command. In meetings, she listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, executives stopped performing and started taking notes. She could read fear in balance sheets, arrogance in governance language, and rot in numbers arranged too beautifully. That was her empire, not marble gates, not charity banners, not borrowed status, but precision. Richard's mansion remained tied up in legal restriction for a long time, its ballroom no longer a theater of admiration, but a cautionary address whispered through private clubs. Jane Valemont disappeared from society calendars, her white dresses replaced by silence and legal counsel. Richard did not become a legend. He became a warning about what happens when a man mistakes possession for power. Sarah did not visit the mansion again. She had no reason to walk through rooms that had once tried to shrink her. One evening, as the city lights came on below her office, a quiet assistant placed a new proposal on her desk from a national financial ethics board. Sarah read the first page, picked up a pen, and signed with steady pressure. Then she stood by the glass, looking out over downtown, her red suit sharp against the darkening skyline. She had found her name again, not on the deed of a house built to contain her, but on the door of a life no one else could edit. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.